Hello and welcome to the
I
ninth,
watched in Russian.
my opinion, one of the
Seeing
best. Hello and welcome to the newest episode of the Brussels Signal podcast. It is with great pleasure that I can introduce you today to Raymond Ibrahim. Raymond, would you do me the favor and introduce yourself a little bit to our guests, because you are a man who is all over the place, and particularly I think they will be curious to hear that you have also been a librarian for quite a while.
Yes. Hi, Ralph. Good to be with you. A quick recap of my background. Egyptian parents, born and raised in the United States, bilingual, English, Arabic, some other languages. Studied Islamic history and doctrine in college. Also did graduate work, Georgetown University, Catholic University when I was in Washington, D.C. Worked at the Library of Congress as a librarian. Focused on Middle Eastern languages, Arabic and Persian, Turkish, etc. And it was there that I actually discovered the writings of Al-Qaeda back in about over 20 years ago. And I translated them. They were my first book. The Al-Qaeda Reader came out in 2007. And since then, I've essentially been a fellow at various think tanks, just publishing and writing articles and other books, and mostly gravitating towards my historical focus, which I had in academically. So my probably my two most famous books are my two last ones, Sword and Scimitar, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and the West, which chronicles all the decisive battles and the overall context between the West and Islam. And as people will tell you, it's very shocking. They always say the response to that book is, why didn't I learn any of this in school? And well, there's a reason. And the other book is Defenders of the West, the Christian Heroes Who Stood Against Islam, which is the same theme, but it's more of a biography-focused book on various different characters, eight heroes, essentially. And just writing up other themes that I follow are the Muslim persecution of Christians, which is and I have a book about that as well. Crucified Again came out in 2013. And I still follow and write reports every month for the Gatestone Institute. And it's a growing pandemic that, again, it's one of those things that few people know about or talk about. And yeah, that's basically what I've been up to.
I mean, you have really emerged as one of the preeminent thinkers on the relationship between Islam and the West. And this has been a topic that has dominating the headlines at least since September 11, 2001. Now, if I would ask you, what are some of the perceptions that most people get wrong when they think, the everyday person, when they think about the relationship of Islam and the West, or the average journalist, what we read in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times about the relationship? What are some of the things that trigger you, if you excuse that expression, when you read about the relationship between the West and Islam?
Yeah, good question. There's many things that trigger me, if you want to use that expression, but actually they don't anymore. I'm rather jaded about the whole thing because it's been going on for over 2 decades and it gets worse. But basically, it's this idea that people like George Bush proclaimed, which is Islam means peace, and that anytime a Muslim engages in any act of radicalism or terrorism, etc., we have to always come up with an excuse to justify it. It's never because the religion is like that. It's because he has a grievance, or because, you'd be surprised at how many times I've come across, and I've written about this, a Muslim who engages in typical Islamic behavior, which is to say vile and violent against non-Muslims, and whatever the case may be. And almost always, and this is especially in Europe, the report concludes that he is mentally sick. That's why he acted that way, or that's why she acted that way. Okay. So it's this constant insistence that, Islam is peace. And when Muslims act in accordance with what I know is Islamic teaching, radical, intolerant, violent, then they come up with any and every excuse you can imagine to justify it, including outright suppression. So when I write it, for example, I was telling you about the persecution of Christians. That's a serious topic, and it's completely ignored. It's just suppressed because there is no way to get around it. What, Muslims have grievances that a small minority of Christians want to pray, and so they destroy their churches. So usually what happens is it's ignored. And we saw an example of this, I think a month ago, somewhere in the Congo, they found in a church 70 Christians decapitated by Muslims. And that got a little, media play. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. This sort of thing, and the carnage of Christians, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa and Nigeria as well, and other countries, is a constant. And the long and short of it is this: if if what Muslims do to others, to non-Muslims, was the opposite, if let's say Christians were doing this to Muslims, it would be all over the news and you would hear about it 24/7. The monthly report I told you I write about Muslim persecution of Christians, um, it's all anecdotes that I find from various websites, and they're all small human rights organizations, etc. And none of them generally make it to the mainstream media. But if it was the opposite, if it was a Christian doing whatever I'm reporting Muslims are doing to Christians, it would make it all over the media, because this is their way of trying to show you, they're trying to show you a certain relativity. It's all the same. Oh, so let's ignore the 100 anecdotes of Muslims killing Christians, and let's find the one anecdote of a Christian attacking Muslims, let's say in New Zealand, for example, that church attack, and let's hype that up. And so the image becomes, oh, actually Muslims are being persecuted. So it's these are the many things that the media and the political and the politicians and the talking heads engage in that I find kind of frustrating. And it's by will, it's willful design. This isn't, we can't say anymore that they're naive. No, this is an intentional camouflage that they're offering.
You have one massive advantage to everybody who engages in this topic, and this is you speak Arabic. So you can actually listen in and read the material, both the source material, but also, let's say, the more modern interpretations of it. So there was about 15 years ago, when ISIS was just starting, there was one headline in the London Times that caught my eye. And the headline said, "More British Muslims joined ISIS than the British armed forces." So my question to you is, if this is something you want to speak about, what makes, particularly for young men, but also we had this case in Austria about 2 women who joined ISIS and they are now returning to Austria, and there were similar cases also in the UK and other places. So if we want to compartmentalize this a little bit, what do you think makes this ideology interesting or attractive, both to men, but apparently also to women? What would be your gut feeling why that is the case?
No, yeah, that's a good question, which I've actually looked into about 20 years ago and wrote specifically about this, the attraction of it. And there's many aspects to it, but first of all, I think in the West, men are so emasculated by design and beat down and told to become women essentially, or they're bad people, and a lot of them do that, and a lot of them deep down inside resent it. So in a way, the Islamic jihadist is a sort of like a heroic pirate figure that I can see a lot of young men gravitate towards. Oh, look, he's masculine, obviously. He's a warrior and he's pious. He's doing this for God. He doesn't stand for any nonsense. He'll decapitate you if you do the wrong thing. So
the Andrew Tate type a little bit.
What's that?
So the Andrew Tate type a little bit.
Yeah. Exactly. That, like that. I think that's very appealing to a lot. And it's also, it wouldn't be appealing if, a more robust form of Christianity was allowed to vent, as it did historically. And as the characters I write about, for example, Defenders of the West, the book I mentioned, these were Christians. They didn't find anything about Islam appealing, but they also understood that their own religion allowed for them to express their masculinity and, a patriarchal society, and to fight back, tit for tat, and that sort of thing. So absent that, as we have now, where, to be a Christian is just, to become a doormat. I mean, that's essentially, I think, the most popular form of Christianity we have right now in the West, as I call it, doormat Christianity. Obviously, a lot of people men don't find that appealing, and women as well. You were pointing out the women. I think even women, because Islam is still traditional and patriarchal, a lot of women are finding that more appealing than the mainstream message of how a woman should be in woke Western culture, which is a turnoff, obviously, for many women as well. And good for them. Obviously, the only outlet available to them is something like Islam, because even though Europe had its own traditional understanding of femininity, that has been so suppressed but they do see the Islamic side that's allowed to vent, and it's being promoted openly in Europe. So I think it becomes appealing to them in that sense.
So you discarded the grievance argument, and I think you make a very good case why this is not a particularly useful argument. But if I play devil's advocate for a second and I spin the grievance argument a little bit and say, well, would it be fair to say that modern political Islam is a reaction to modernity, or is a reaction to what you just described, that it's less on the just religious, but actually also reactionary in a sense? that, as you said, right, the emasculation, if you want, of manhood in the West then led to the resurgence of Islam because it doesn't appear weak or feminized, that it seems that it still has these quote unquote patriarchal masculine values, that it's not so much an autonomous religion/ideology that emerged, but that it actually is a reaction to something that quote unquote went wrong in the West.
Yeah, I actually don't agree with that because it's not really a matter of either or. It can be both. And I do believe that, in fact, I've written a lot about how it's a reaction to the West, what we're seeing. And, if you look back at the history of Islam and, the colonial era, I always argue that Islam is might makes right. And that's the logic. And that's why Muslims gravitated towards it for centuries. It actually elevated you because now you can fight back and you can plunder and you can enslave people, and doing so makes you righteous. Okay. And then with the colonial era, everything was shifted. Now the West became, historically, the West was the underdog. It was the one that was being beaten and chipped away at, and people don't know that. But it finally made its major comeback with the colonial era. This is where the West is ascendant now. And it's in the Islamic world and all in Asia and Africa, etc. And believe it or not, in that time, in the 1800s and very early 1900s, Muslims were very Western looking, which means they looked up to Western people because they were more powerful than them and they wanted to emulate them. If you look at Turkey, the Ottoman Turkish Empire, which was the scourge of Christendom for centuries, and it was the standard bearer of jihad, it was also the first country to immediately get rid of all of its Islamic wrappings and become as Western as it possibly could under Ataturk, the great modernizer. They got rid of the Arabic script and adopted the Roman alphabet. And it became all the men shaved and wore suits. So what you had is, the West was unapologetically triumphant, and the Islamic world was trying to emulate that. And then you get, let's say, in the 60s, everything switches around, and now the West hates itself, rejects itself, loves every other culture, promotes every other culture. The emasculation we're talking about, the sexual perversion and depravity, all of that, 60s stuff comes in. And it really turns off lots of Muslims all around the world. You get this in the writings of Sayyid Qutb, the chief theoretician of the Muslim Brotherhood, who visited America, I believe, in the 50s, and was appalled at what he saw. And the idea became, take from the West their scientific knowledge and technology and their way of doing things, but definitely let's stay with our own culture because they've lost their minds, essentially. And obviously, there's thinking that even more so now when they see this transgender nonsense going on. So definitely, there's a certain level Muslim reactionary going on to what they're seeing as happening in the West. But at the same time, it is still intrinsic to the religion, and that's what makes it so potent. It's not just a reaction that came out of a vacuum. That is the religion. The religion is hyper masculine, hyper patriarchal, hyper intolerant, by nature. So, the two of them are feeding into each other.
Do you think there's always a debate about, we hear this now, for example, in Syria, right, with the new leadership in Syria. Is there something, how would you define the idea of a moderate political Islam? Or is there no such a thing? Is this just something that Westerners like to tell themselves so that they can sleep better at night?
Yeah, it's the latter. In Muslim, and I say this based on what Muslims say, and Muslims have repeatedly, Erdogan himself has said there is no, he mocked the term moderate Islam as an insult. Because, and it really is, it's an adjective, it's qualifying Islam. Islam is submission, that's what the word means. Submission to the laws and the words of Allah and his prophet, as captured in the Sunnah and the Hadith, the Quran, etc. Okay, so where's the moderation? It's black and white. It's either you do this or you don't do that. Okay, moderation suggests that somehow, Muslims are going to take the body of Islam and they're going to moderate it to adapt to Western sensibilities, let's say, or modern sensibilities. And they can do that. I don't argue that I'm not saying that can't be done. So I do believe there are moderate Muslims because Muslims are individuals who are subjective. But I don't believe there's a moderate Islam. Islam is what Islam is, and it's what it has been historically. And it's a very black and white religion. There's no shades of gray. In fact, according to Islamic law, there's 5 categories that every act in life fall within, which is forbidden, disliked, not recommended to do, neutral, recommended, you can do, we should do, but you don't have to, and obligatory. Everything in life falls into that. So, how does the concept of, Western moderation fit into that? It doesn't.
You are an expert both on the history of Islam and also on the history of Christianity. So one thing I was always wondering is if we would compare the split in Christianity, particularly between Catholicism and Protestantism, and the split in Islam between Sunni and Shia, could you illuminate a little bit for us? How big are the differences between Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims? Is it comparable to the split within the Catholic Church, or is it completely different?
It's both. It's comparable, but it's also very different. The Catholic Protestant split, as we know, comes around with Martin Luther on 1517. And basically now you have the printing press and people have access to the Bible, and they're just saying, okay, what the clergy is telling us, a lot of it doesn't make sense. It doesn't comport with Scripture. So now we want to split. Okay, the Sunni Shia split was actually based on succession. And people forget this. It was basically you have the first four righteous caliphs after Muhammad. Caliph means successor to Muhammad. And finally, it really came down to we want the descendants of Muhammad via his cousin Ali and Muhammad's daughter Fatima. Okay, so therefore the Shias wanted the caliph to be somehow a blood descendant of Muhammad, whereas the Sunnis wanted just whoever is capable, the best fit man for the job. So that's the origin of it, really, right around 650 or 660. But since then, since that breakup, obviously the Shias and the Sunnis have also theologically had vast differences. The Shias are very mystical, and they have very esoteric, almost occult-like teachings, whereas the Sunnis are a little more pragmatic and mainstream. But ironically, the Sunnis are, I would argue, more intolerant and more violent towards the non-Muslim. In fact, the Shias, they perfected the concept of taqiyya, which is, living in deceit, living lying, pretending to be you're not what you are, pretending to like who you hate, etc. And they did that because they lived amongst Sunnis. And the Sunnis, had they known they're Shias, they would have persecuted and killed them. So that's why the Shias really perfected the art of taqiyya, even though all Muslims, including Sunnis, engage in it. But anyway, and also it's important to keep in mind that I don't know the exact numbers, but I think maybe all the world's Catholics versus the world's Protestants, number-wise, are probably similar. I don't know, maybe Catholics are more. Whereas the Sunni Shia thing, it's about 90% Sunni, and the Shias are essentially mostly in Iran, but other smaller countries nearby also as well. So they're more or less politically disenfranchised, except for Iran, which is obviously a powerful nation. But yeah, they historically they would fight each other when no one else is there, but once the infidel comes in, then they side together. Which makes sense. We're still close enough to be allied against the total outsider, but once we don't have problems with the outsider, then we fight amongst each other.
One of the reasons I was asking this question is because since 2001 there must have been, or what felt like, a million articles saying what Islam needs is a reformation. What Islam needs is their own Martin Luther. And some would say that Martin Luther, in fact, was a radical himself. So that might be the worst thing to happen. So, and I'm sure you came across these articles as well. What is your reaction to this idea? Or is it even possible? Is let's say, radical Islam the reformation of Islam that we saw actually happening? Or is there something coming in the future that would resemble something like, I think when people say reformation, what they actually mean is a secularization of religion. Do you think that's currently in the cards in the near future? In the long run, everything is possible. Or do you think, once again, this is something where the optimism gets the better part of us?
Yeah, I do think that what people mean by Reformation, or when they think of Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation, something akin to that has actually already happened. And it has led to what we call radical Islam, or better known as Wahhabiism or Salafism. And I'll explain. But basically, both Christianity and Islam, when you go back down the centuries, again, before the printing press, the people who knew what Islam was all about they're known in Arabic as the ulama, which means the scholars of Islam. They were the ones who were literate. Your average Muslim, just like your average Christian in Europe, was not literate. And even if there were no copies of the Bible or the Quran, respectively. So most people just believed what they were told by the leaders. But now with the printing press and everything's available now today, you have the internet, and anyone can just at a click of a button, they have the entire Quran on their screen, the Hadith, which was very hard to access. And in fact, Westerners, the Orientalists, were the ones who really collated it for Muslims. Now it's all available, and Muslims, like Westerners, are a lot more literate. And what happens is, and you even have a figure who is like Martin Luther, and his name is Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, Saudi, and he was allied with the Saudis. And he's known as a reformer. They refer to him as a reformer. What he did is he said, look, when we read the Quran and the Hadith, etc., it's black and white. But there had been a lot of accretions that built into Islam over the centuries that were not necessarily part of the original corpus. So they cleaned it all out, and the net result, from a non-Muslim perspective, is very much more radical. It was actually tempered in a way, because it just evolved organically, and people had to be able to live with each other and their neighbors to some extent. But a strict black and white reading of the scriptures is such that it makes it even more radical. And it really comes down to a simple question, which is, how can Muslims and Christians do the same thing, which is leave the clergy and the authorities and focus on their scriptures, and yet it leads to something diametrically opposed? And the simple answer, of course, is the Bible and the Quran are so different. And to your typical secularist, they won't get that because they just lump all religious books together. But the New Testament teaches monogamy, Islam teaches polygamy and sex slaves, concubinage. The New Testament teaches forgiveness. Islam is about vengeance. In the New Testament, you're supposed to pray for your enemies, and if someone leaves Christianity, an apostate, they're not supposed to be executed. In Islam, they are. So this is why a return to the scriptures, which has happened for both religions, is really bringing out what they're all about. But the other point is, yes, and this is the problem. Most people, when they talk about a reformation, what they mean is they want Islam to undergo an enlightenment, which is really different. An enlightenment would be Muslims basically saying, okay, that's enough of that. We need to rise above these teachings of Islam. They're obviously, they're not for our times, and they can rationalize it whichever way they want. And that happens as well, but there isn't a huge or mainstream example of it, because honestly, the cleaner and more genuine thing a Muslim can do who reaches that point is just leave Islam. And that's what happens. They apostatize, they become Christians, they become atheists, or whatever the case may be. But that's realistically, more in the cards. But to try to adapt Islam so it fits in neatly with modernity is essentially to just rewrite the entire religion. At which point, it becomes so insincere for those who are doing it that you're better off just starting anew.
You mentioned the printing press, and one very popular comparison with what was once the printing press is now the internet. And the reason I'm mentioning this is after there were a couple of prevented terrorist attacks or attempted terrorist attacks, particularly by young men in Europe. Now there is this new theory that is popularized once again in the media, which is that this is a TikTok radicalization. So it's young men. They call it in German, it sounds a bit better, but what they more or less call high-speed radicalization. So they say, it's young men, they watch a couple of TikTok videos, and within 4 weeks, they become radicalized. What is your take on this? Because it sounds like radicalization is like catching a cold. So, you walk out the day, you turn on your computer, you pick up your phone, and then you watch the wrong video, and 3 weeks later, you start to plan a terrorist attack. Is this, I don't know, can I always come back to the same question, but I'm so curious about your take on this. But do you think this is, once again, us not taking the actual depth of the ideology and the message seriously enough if we argue that, well, this is just a couple of mentally ill or unstable young men who watch a handful of TikTok videos and then decide they want to become jihadis?
Yeah, right. I associate it with what we spoke about before, which is it's another one of those sorts of excuses to sidestep the real issue at hand, which is the teachings themselves, and just say, oh, this is a frustrated youth who was having a bad patch in his life, and he watched this video and it just threw him over the edge, and that's exactly what they say. Could there be truth to that, with this and that individual? Sure. There's all sorts of precursors to why people do what they do. But again, it's always, they continue to sidestep the real issue, which is the religion itself promotes this. And so when a person, whether they're sane or insane, reads the texts and they say, hate the infidel, fight the infidel, and kill him, slaughter him wherever you can find him, as in Quran 9:5, the sword verse. It is what it says, and I can be perfectly sane and act on it. I'm not insane because I'm acting on it. So again, they're pointing fingers at the wrong directions. Should be pointed at Islamic teachings and scriptures, but it's intentionally so that they're doing this.
When we look at the Islamic world proper, particularly the Arab world, there is a lot of hope, at least, that countries like Saudi Arabia with Mohammed bin Salman, that they try, or the United Arab Emirates, that they try to modernize, they try to push their countries into the future, if you will. It's a more progressive direction. That might be a correct way to put it. And when we talk not so much about the elites, but if we focus a little bit more on the people in the Arab world, particularly, but maybe in the broader Muslim world, can any form of government have legitimacy if they don't take religion at least a little bit into account? And the reason why I'm asking this is because it seems to me that especially after the Arab Spring and after also now the civil war in Syria, but also in Afghanistan, what we saw with the return of the Taliban, that any form of maybe not good governance, but at least stable governance seems to have some connection to religious sources or to the matter of Islam. So is it truly, hypothetically, would a truly secular government or governance ever be possible in that part of the world? In the short term, again, on the long term, many things are possible.
Yeah, in the short term, I doubt it, because, like you said, every single one of these, especially Arab nations, but Muslim nations in general, have some sort of some stipulations that involve religion, Islam. As one example, Egypt, its constitution, Article 2, and I think this was introduced under Sadat, Anwar Sadat, maybe in the 70s, basically says legislation in Egypt is traced back to and based on Sharia. Okay. And that's very problematic for non-Muslims, the Copts of Egypt. They often point to that because, Sharia is inherently anti-infidel, anti-non-Muslim. It's discriminatory. So, for example, Sharia says you can't build new churches and you can't even renovate old ones. Guess what? That's the case in Egypt. It's very, very hard for them to even renovate. Muslims will attack a church that already exists because they tried to repair the bathroom, or tried to build, 2 feet high kind of thing, and they'll just slip out because it goes back to Sharia. And here you have a nation who actually enshrines that kind of thinking. Again, to your average Westerner, when they hear what I just said, Article 2 is based on Sharia. What's so bad about that? After all, we're already told that Sharia is not bad. It's not draconian. It's actually humanitarian, et cetera, et cetera. So, the lies are just so multi-layered, and they help, and it's what fuels all the confusion. But yeah, most, if not all, Arab nations have some sorts of stipulation or connection back to Islamic teaching, and that is, in fact, how they derive their legitimacy.
In your travels and your research, is there any particular country at the moment that you find warrants our special interest, that you have a special eye on? There's, whether it's maybe Turkey or Saudi Arabia or Tunisia or Indonesia, is there where you say, okay, this is a country, the things that we see happening there that could be a harbinger for the future. This is what's happening there will resonate in the broader Muslim world.
Yeah, I think what is always overlooked and underestimated and ignored, it's Sub-Saharan Africa. And ISIS and all these radicals have really fled to and inundated that continent. And you can see it in the behavior of what's happening to the Christians there. It's literally a genocide. I already mentioned the 70 decapitated corpses found in a church. But like I said, that's just, par for the course. That sort of thing. Maybe it's not 70, but it's 20, every other week or something like that. It's very, very common. And they're also, it's not just the slaughter of Christians and destruction of churches, but it's the overall radicalization of the Muslims in those regions. And, it's becoming a safe haven for all these terrorists. So I'm not saying it's the most important at all, but I am saying it's very much overlooked and ignored and just, sidestepped altogether. And I think it deserves a lot more attention than it normally gets, especially from a humanitarian point of view. We like to pretend we're humanitarian. We care, Western civilization. And we're always if we go to war, it's for humanitarian purposes. Well, if that's really the case, then I think we should kind of turn an eye over there as well. I don't know if you know this, but here in America, Black Lives Matter. That's a saying, right? After George Floyd was killed. And it's like, I guess they do, but they don't matter if it's thousands of Christians being killed by Muslims. Then we don't talk about it. But aside from that, obviously, all the nations that you mentioned as well, Turkey, Erdogan has these grand aspirations of becoming a neo-Ottoman sultan, essentially. And Saudi Arabia, the thing with Saudi Arabia, I understand all this reform that it's engaged in and so forth, but they're really the source of all the problems, if you want to look at it, because their money, they're so wealthy from oil, they are the chief disseminators of the radical ideology of Islam. Any mosque you go in Europe or even in America or in the Middle East, and it's teaching Wahhabi literature or Salafist literature, fundamentalist, it's all traced right back to Saudi Arabia and its oil wealth. So it's kind of playing this two-pronged game where it tries to show some sort of moderation and reform, but at the same time, it's the nation that's chiefly funding the radicalization of Muslims all around the world.
Do you think that one difference maybe in the Arab, when we talk about Turkey or Iran, is that both Turkey and Iran also have a strong nationalist or civilizational tradition, if you want, that the Iranians are aware of the Persian past, the Turks are aware of the Ottoman past, that potentially can insulate them a little bit from the more radical teaching, as you just mentioned, that emanate from a country like Saudi Arabia, for example?
Yeah, I do think that, and that is the case. In Iran, it's even more so because they're technically a different religion. They're Shias. They have nothing to do with Wahhabis. Same thing with Turkey. They have their very proud and rich jihadist heritage and history, and their language. That's the thing. The nations that got conquered or became Islamic, but kept their language, such as Iran, Persia, and the Turks. They unlike, let's say, Egypt, they had their own language, the Coptic language, which is the Pharaonic language, but it was actually it was actually under one particular caliph, it was actually banned, and he threatened to cut the tongues off of the people if they speak it. But yeah, language carries with it culture, and so I think those two nations have their own sort of destiny, if you will, but they're still Muslim, and they still, according to them, they still see themselves as the standard bearers. Like I said, Turkey is the final manifestation for centuries of the standard bearer of Islam, especially of jihad. And they still know that and still see that. They regularly, when they celebrate, the conquest of Constantinople, May 29, 1453, and it's presented as this wonderful day. And I just laugh because living here in America, where Americans are supposed to be ashamed of their heroes, and the statues and monuments are being destroyed for George Washington and whoever, Abraham Lincoln, even in places like Turkey, they extol and love and worship men who were basically ISIS on steroids. And all they did is just attack innocent regions because they're Christian, slaughter everyone, rape everyone, destroy every church. Okay. And, and that's what their sources say. But these are the people they put on pedestals and praise. So it tells you a lot about, their thinking process.
If hypothetically your phone would ring and Donald Trump would be on the other end and he would say, Raymond, I want to completely redo the policies, the politics of the United States vis-a-vis the Islamic world, vis-a-vis the Muslim world, and he wants your advice. What would be the core of the advice that you would give to the current president of the United States?
Well, really, the most fundamental advice I would say, which would be, this would apply to the people, but especially to the powers that be, the authorities and the government, is enough with the whitewashing, enough with the lies. Okay, let's first start off by, as a blank slate, understanding what Islam is about, its history, its doctrine. If you do that, and this is the problem, this is why it's frustrating. If you do that, everything falls into play. Then how to treat and how to deal with Islam becomes a product of common sense. But until you get that first premise situated, and as long as you're still thinking that Islam is inherently peaceful, Muslims are just reflecting grievances, etc., you're going to get nowhere. So the first step is just having an accurate understanding of Islamic history and doctrine.
Raymond, before I let you go, I think after this conversation, which is very crucial, where can people find your work, and where do you want them to find your work? So what's the best way to find out the large oeuvre of your writings, of your videos, of your appearances?
Yeah, thanks. For years, it's been really my website, RaymondIbrahim.com, RaymondIbrahim.com, and that's where all my writings and articles and links to books, etc. But I've also been developing my YouTube channel, so you can just, I think if you put my name, it's called the Holy War channel, but because I deal with that theme often from both sides. But yeah, it's on YouTube, and I've been increasingly doing more videos, and I hope to do some more down the line, but either one of those should work.
All right. Raymond Ibrahim, thank you so much for the time, and I'm very much looking forward to having you on the show again.
Great. Thanks very much, Ralph.